Hi everyone, and welcome to the next video in our series exploring labour markets. Now, what we've done so far, we've looked at a video which focused on the demand for labour, and then we had a separate video looking at the supply of labour. What we're now going to do is to put them both together to get a labour market equilibrium diagram. Now, when we put supply and demand together, we can work out what wage rates will be across the economy, but we can also see how many people will be employed across the economy as well. So guys, look at this then. At this labour market equilibrium point of W1 in this first diagram here, the demand is equal to the supply of labour. So we've got here a labour market clearing wage. Now, what's interesting about this point is if labour markets were perfect and worked like this perfectly through the forces of supply and demand, we would have zero unemployment. The demand for labour would be identical to the supply of labour. Now think about how this would happen. In the top right-hand corner diagram, you can see what would happen if we operated above the equilibrium wage of W1. So in this diagram, if we operated at W2, then we would have in this labour market excess supply of labour. The supply of labour would be at Q3, but the demand for labour will only be at Q2. Now, what this will mean is in this labour market at the moment, we would have unemployment. But if the price mechanism is allowed to do its job properly and there are no failures in the market, then this problem will fix itself. Wage rates will adjust to clear the excess supply of labour. Now, think about it logically. If you've got unemployment, you've got more people willing and able to work than what there is demand for workers, then wage rates will fall. And as wage rates fall, there will be a contraction in the supply of labour. People have got less incentive to supply their labour as wage rates fall, so it will contract. The demand for labour would also extend. As wage rates fall, it becomes more profitable to recruit people, so you get that extension in the demand for labour. And look what happens. The labour market will clear at W1, Q1. The workings of the invisible hand have fixed the excess supply problem in the market. Now look at the bottom diagram. If we set a wage rate below W1, so below the equilibrium point, this time you would get an excess demand for labour. Supply of labour would be at Q2, not enough in effect, but the demand for labour would be all the way out here at Q3. So in other words, what we're going to get this time are shortages of workers. The wage rate on offer is not enough to incentivise enough people to want to supply their labour. Now, the way that the invisible hand will fix this problem is by raising wage rates. As wage rates increase, we're going to get a little bit of a contraction in the demand for labour, with the reason being if workers start to become more expensive, then firms become less willing and able to recruit people, less chance of making profit from these workers. But as wage rates grow, there will also be an extension in the supply of labour. That growth in wage rates will incentivise more people to want to work across the economy. And the labour market will therefore clear at W1, Q1. So guys, you can see here how the free market economy would make sure that labour markets will clear. We get to that magic point where the demand for labour is equal to the supply of labour. Now look what we've got here then. Now, in the first video in this series, we were exploring what makes the demand for labour shift. Now, look what happens then. What we can see here is an outward shift in the demand for labour. So we're looking here at a non-wage reason why the demand for labour has increased. Now, look what this will then create in the labour market. The idea would be we've now got this problem here. I'll call that Q3. If we have an outward shift in the demand for labour, maybe due to derived demand theory, growing demand for goods and services, that type of thing, we're now going to have an excess demand problem in the labour market. Demand's all the way at Q3, but the supply of labour is only at Q1. Now, the way the labour market will fix this problem is by creating a new market equilibrium point at W2, Q2. Now, the way this will happen is as follows. Due to the excess demand for labour, shortages, wage rates will start to grow. We're going to get a little bit of a contraction in the demand for labour, and then we can get an extension in the supply of labour. Now, guys, that orange stuff there is additional things. The main thing is the green information. So you can see that when we have an outward shift in the demand for labour, what we're going to see in the labour market will be a growth in the wage rate and an increase in the number of people employed in the economy. Now look at the diagram on the right-hand side. When the demand for labour shifts inwards, maybe due to falling productivity of workers, substitutes such as capital becoming cheaper, we've got less people being demanded to work across the economy. Now this would lead to wage rates falling and less people being employed. Now that's fine, nothing wrong with that diagram, but what we can do, we can think about why. Now look, we had originally supply and demand were equal to each other at W1, but when the demand for labour shifted inwards, that created an excess demand for labour. Sorry, I beg your pardon, an excess supply of labour. So the supply of labour would be at Q1, but the demand for labour is now at Q3. So to clear the labour market, wage rates would need to fall. That would create an extension in the demand for labour and a contraction in the supply of labour. Next diagrams, look at these. Now we've got here outward shifts and inward shifts in the supply of labour. Now look at the impacts of this on labour markets. If the supply of labour was to move outwards, maybe due to a reduction in the cost of working, better non-monetary benefits, then we're going to get this impact on the labour market, lower wage rates and an increase in employment levels. If the supply of labour moves inwards, then we're going to get an equilibrium point here where the wage rates will go up and there'll be a reduction in employment levels. Now those diagrams are fine, but again, what we can do, we can show how we tackle excess demand and supply that might be created. Now look at the first diagram then. Supply and demand used to be equal to each other, that orange blob. But when the supply of labour moves outwards, then we've now got at W1 a bigger supply of labour than what there is demand for labour. So that would mean that wage rates will need to fall to clear the labour market. As wage rates fall, you're going to get an extension in the demand for labour and you're going to get a contraction in the supply of labour to make sure the labour market clears at W2, Q2. Now the diagram on the right hand side, look what would happen if the supply of labour moved inwards. Originally at wage 1, W1, the supply and demand were equal to each other at the orange blob, but now the supply of labour is at Q3. So to clear the labour market, wage rates would need to grow. That would lead to an extension in the supply of labour and a contraction in the demand for labour. Now everyone, this next slide here is just to show you how you can use elasticity to your advantage. If you were asked to evaluate how an increase in the demand for labour would impact on wage rates and employment. Now look what we said earlier on. In the left-hand side diagram here, we said that if the demand for labour moved outwards, there'd be a growth in wage rates and there'd be a growth in employment. But what we would argue is which one shifts the most or increases the most would depend on the wage elasticity of supply. And look what you've got. When the demand for labour, sorry, I beg your pardon, when the supply of labour is wage inelastic, when the demand for labour moves outwards, there'll be a more significant impact on wage rates than there will employment levels. But when the supply of labour is wage elastic, the impact is more significant on the number of people employed than it would be on wage rates. Now, in both diagrams, both wage rates and employment will increase when the demand for labour moves outwards, but which one changes the most would depend on the wage elasticity of supply. So if the supply of labour is inelastic, there'll be a much more significant impact on wage rates than employment levels. If the supply of labour is elastic, there'll be a more significant impact on employment levels than wage rates. Now look at the bottom two diagrams. Imagine you were given a question, to what extent will an inward shift in the supply of labour lead to higher wage rates and lower employment? You can be thinking about how wage elasticity demand can help you. Now think about the logic behind it though, first of all. When the supply of labour moves inwards, we'd expect wage rates to go up and employment to go down. Well, the extent to which it will happen will depend on the wage elasticity of demand. Now, in both of these two diagrams, wage rates will go up and employment will go down. But the magnitude, the size of the change, again, will depend on wage elasticity of demand. If the demand for labour was wage inelastic, for example, the impact would be more significant on wage rates than it would be employment levels. But if the demand for labour is elastic, then the impact will be more significant on the demand for labour as opposed to the wage rate. So guys, elasticity is a really, really good thing to remember when it comes to thinking about the magnitude of the impacts on wage rates and employment. But everyone, the big takeaway point is this. Labour markets, they will clear where the demand for labour is equal to the supply of labour. That's how you calculate wage rates across the economy. If you've got excess supply of labour, wage rates will need to go down. If you've got an excess demand for labour, wage rates will need to go up. So what we now know is when the demand for labour moves outwards, wage rates will go up and employment will go up. If the demand for labour comes inwards, wage rates will fall and less people will be employed. If the supply of labour moves outwards, there'll be an increase in employment, but wage rates will go down. If the supply of labour moves inwards, then wage rates will grow, but employment levels will go down. And then we thought about how elasticity would affect the magnitude. In other words, how much would it affect wage rates and employment levels? Right, everyone, thank you very much. That is the end of labour market equilibrium diagrams.